So we'll just start with some basic background. The RAD notice is Housing Notice 2019-09, PIH Notice 2019-23. It's a joint housing PIH notice that we will call RAD Notice Rev 4. It was published on September 5th, 2019. It supersedes all prior RAD notices, including the supplemental RAD notices that were published last year. It consists of 4 sections. The first section covers public housing, and second section mod rehab, third section rent supplement RAP, and the fourth new section on 202 pracs, on the conversion of 202 pracs. As always, this revision of the RAD notice benefited from feedback received from prior versions of the notice and the ideas and suggestions from diverse stakeholders. So thank you all, and keep the feedback and communication coming. Just some quick highlights. There's some of the more major things that this notice does with respect to public housing conversions is it standardizes resident rights when RAD is mixed with non-RAD project-based vouchers, provides greater flexibility for PHAs converting portfolios of public housing by streamlining the portfolio and multi-phase awards, creates some new rent flexibilities for certain conversions that are in opportunity zones, and improves the use of RAD and Section 18 together. Creates abilities for PHAs to partner together to find mutually beneficial arrangements that facilitate stronger RAD conversions. And it introduces a concept call prior to financing plan submission. We'll get into each of these in greater detail later. Just want to hit some of the big ones off the bat. Reminder for just to frame out how we'll be walking through the presentation. It'll more or less be chronological order, and just a quick refresher on our overall process. PHAs begin with RAD with a RAD application where we confirm project eligibility and ensure that residents and the board have been consulted. HUD issues then a CHAP award, which reserves the conversion authority under our 455,000 unit cap, and it also sets forth the contract rents. The PHA then works towards building and developing a financing plan that needs to do certain things besides basic due diligence before then, including certain upfront civil rights reviews and transfer of assistance approval, amending its PHA plan, must hold additional resident meetings. And when it submits its financing plan, the PHA is demonstrating to HUD, to recap, the physical and financial viability of the property and its compliance with all of our program requirements. We approve the financing plan by issuing a RAD conversion commitment, which sets out the terms of closing and the agreed scope of work that will occur as part of the conversion. Then the property closes, we remove it from the public housing ACC and declaration of trust. We enter into a new Section 8 HAP contract and record the use agreement, a new RAD use agreement on the property. Then after closing, any applicable work begins. And it must be completed in accordance with the terms set out in the RAD conversion commitment. And the property is now in the PBV or PBRA platform and under those asset management and occupancy rules. Okay. With that frame in mind, we're going to walk through the major changes in Revision 4 to program requirements. So starting off with eligibility and application, Revision 4 eliminates any priority categories for which types of properties get awarded. It states that if a waiting list were to arise, and we're a ways off from meeting a waiting list at this point, but if one were to arise, it establishes a preference for properties that are in designated opportunity zones. Revision 4 eliminates the prior restrictions on certain Hope 6 properties that were under 10 years old, and it minimizes application requirements, which we've already implemented on the resource task, which is where PHAs apply to RAD. So the upshot is there is no class of properties that's in good standing with HUD that is ineligible or that would currently be deprioritized for an award. Revision 4 modifies portfolio awards quite substantially. We've expanded timing flexibility for PHAs converting a self-defined portfolio of properties while hopefully creating a simpler structure. A PHA can reserve conversion authority under the 455,000 unit cap and the applicable RAD rents at the time of submission for a portfolio of properties by providing HUD the total number of units to be converted, and RAD applications for the lesser of 4 projects, or 25% of the units identified in the portfolio. So this is a loosening of the prior stricter standards for portfolio awards. And our requirements for retaining the portfolio award is that the PHA must close, on average, starting 1 year after the issuance of the first CHAP, either 2 projects per year or 25% of the units identified in the portfolio per year. So HUD will be monitoring not when PHAs come in with new applications from their portfolio award, but will be focused more on the closings that PHAs execute on. Moving on, any multi-phase and portfolio awards that exist today would be converted into new portfolio awards. So PHAs that have existing multi-phase or portfolio awards will be held to the same standard, which is that they must close on average starting 1 year from September 5th, which is when the notice is published, either 2 projects per year or 25% of the units identified in the portfolio per year. So the concept of a multi-phase award is eliminated altogether. Units for multi-phase redevelopments are instead reserved through the portfolio award, and each phase that's completed would be counted towards the minimum unit or project closing requirements. And then still, final applications are still due by September 30th, 2024. So overall, we think this will provide PHAs more flexibility in completing the conversion of multiple projects and or phases, particularly larger PHAs as they try to thoughtfully manage the conversion of large portfolios. As many folks know quite well, initial contract rents under RAD are calculated based on public housing operating fund and capital fund appropriations. As we've talked about, the CHAPs and the portfolio awards lock in the RAD rent base year based on the time of award. PHAs can always request to update those rents as new rents become available, but the CHAP and portfolio award holds that import of locking in a certain RAD rent base year. Revision 4 helps to create a schedule for when the RAD rents get updated. We've so far periodically been updating those RAD rents based on fiscal year appropriations, but now we're going to go into a biennial cycle. So any awards that are made now through the end of 2020 would be using what we call the FY18 RAD rents. Those are the ones that are currently published on our site. Those CHAP rents would be adjusted by OCAF starting in 2019 and until the property converts. And then for awards made starting in 2021 and into 2022, we'll have FY20 RAD rents, again, where the OCAF would first be applied in 2021, and so on and so forth. So and for awards made in 2023 or 2024, we'll have FY22 base rents. So hoping to create a predictable cycle for the production of new RAD rents going forward. Speaking of RAD rents, the notice introduces a new ability to increase rents. Provides up to $100 per unit per month in a rent bump for PBRA conversions that involve new construction or substantial rehab, that is construction including general requirements, overhead and profit, and payment and performance bonds, in excess of 60% of the housing construction costs. The same standard we currently use in the RAD Section 18 blend. For properties that are within a designated opportunity zone and where it's necessary for the viability of the conversion. We've already received a number of questions on this. We'll soon be posting processing guidance, including how to request the conditional CHAP amendment so that PHAs have rents or conditional rents they can share with their financing partners, as well as how HUD will assess whether the increased rents are necessary for the viability of the conversion. So we're excited about this, and we're hopeful that it will make more transformative transactions possible that are in opportunity zones. Once awarded a CHAP, all financing plans are now due on a standard 270-day time frame. We fully expect that there are going to be transactions that require more than that, and extensions are permitted contingent on reasonable justification. And we require, though, that if any extension exceeds 6 months, the PHA must hold or show evidence of an additional resident meeting. Again, standardizing when the financing plan will be due for all CHAPs in 270 days, and then allowing for extensions. Speaking of resident meetings, of course, it's always been important for any PHA implementing RAD that PHAs and partners maintain regular communication with residents throughout the conversion process in order to describe the conversion plans, solicit feedback, and ensure residents understand the impacts, make sure there are no misunderstandings. They clearly understand what is going on throughout the process. Revision 4 expands the minimum requirement resident meetings. We still have the 2 resident meetings before the RAD application, but now we have requiring 2 additional resident meetings before the financing plan. There had been 1 before then in the prior versions of RAD. 1 would be before the concept call, which we'll talk about shortly, and 1 will be between the concept call, or at least 1 between the concept call and financing plan. Of course, these are minimum requirements. PHAs are encouraged to take whatever measures are necessary to make sure there is routine and steady communication with residents. We also require that the PHA would have to hold additional meetings if there are either significant changes to the project plans as previously presented in prior meetings, or again, if there are extensions in excess of 6 months, which means that if there is a complex tax credit transaction that might take a year and a half or 20 months to implement on, there would be a total of at least 6 resident meetings that would happen in that context, and so on and so forth. Just a reminder, of course, that any resident meetings should accommodate those with disabilities, as well as accommodate residents with different languages. Prior versions of the RAD notice contained fair housing and civil rights review requirements that preceded the publication of the broader RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Notice, Housing PH Notice 2016-17. The RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Notice contains much more thorough information regarding upfront civil rights reviews than the language that we had in this RAD notice, which had more basic information. To eliminate duplication and potential conflict, Revision 4 removed the language regarding certain requirements, the upfront reviews, and instead refers readers to the RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Notice. Just want to make sure folks are very clear that the removal of this language does not modify any of the requirements contained in the RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Notice. It's just simplifying the language that's in the RAD notice. Okay, moving on to PHA partnerships. Revision 4 provides for increased flexibility for PHAs to partner and find mutually beneficial exchanges of resources and or capacity in order to broaden the viability of public housing conversions. We are seeking to allow PHAs to exchange resources subject to a mutual agreement to be approved by HUD without forming a consortium or without going through a consolidation process. So the specific flexibilities that we're making available, so allowing PHAs, extending flexibilities that were already in the notice for PHAs converting their own properties, extending that to partnerships. So PHAs can contribute public housing funds as a development source into another PHA's conversion, or trade in replacement housing factor or demolition, disposition, transition funding to increase rents for another PHA's conversion. They can rent bundle with another PHA. They can transfer available land under a DOT to another PHA, or potentially propose other partnership arrangements. Now, this is on top of some things PHAs have already done, which is selecting another PHA to administer the PBV contract, particularly for PHAs that don't have a voucher program, transferring assistance outside of the PHA's jurisdiction, providing development guarantees, or serving as a developer or as the management agent, or even transferring or consolidating PHA's HCP program. So what we're trying to do here is allow PHAs with varying resources and capacity to work together and to see if they can find ways to make more conversions work by marrying resources. Revision 4 also introduces the concept call, which is prior to submitting a financing plan, a PHA must now request a concept call with HUD via the RAD resource desk. On the concept call, the PHA would be describing the conversion plan and demonstrating that the plans are sufficiently advanced to warrant review of the financing plan by HUD. If acceptable, HUD will subsequently invite the PHA to submit the financing plan. This will be fully implemented for any financing plan submitted on or after October 7th, 2019. We wanted to give PHAs at least a month before since the notice was published to acclimate to this. We'll soon have a concept call checklist on the resource desk, and we'll be announcing some training on the concept call shortly. With respect to the capital needs assessment, revision 4 makes 2 important changes. First, it eliminates the need to submit a utility consumption baseline. So that's going to be true for any conversions for any CNA submitted. And then second, for any transactions that are using 9% tax credits or new construction, or for properties that have been newly constructed or that have used 9% tax credits in the last 5 years, whereas the prior RAD notices had already exempted the narrative, which described the rehab needs of the property. Revision 4 now exempts these class of properties from submitting the financial model or reserve analysis, as long as the PHA and owner agree to an initial annual deposit through replacement reserve of at least $450 per unit per year. The PHA could still justify a lower amount with a CNA, but if they would like to forego the CNA process altogether, would need to agree to that minimum annual deposit through replacement reserve. Moving on to environmental reviews, revision 4 requires now that all Part 50 reviews must be submitted through HEROES. This has been encouraged for years and has been gradually adopted. And now in revision 4, it's going to be required for all Part 50 reviews. Revision 4 also extends the tiered review concept more broadly. So for conversions with no rehab that are under Part 50, HUD has made program-wide compliance determinations for most of the applicable environmental laws and authorities, and will complete a site-specific compliance review only for coastal protection, flood insurance, and floodplain management, and for contamination. So this significantly simplifies the environmental review process for conversions that entail no rehab. We now require radon testing just in compliance with MAP Guide requirements under Part 50. Follow the MAP Guide. Under Part 58, if there's rehab, the PHA would either provide a statement that the responsible entity examined radon or would submit a separate radon report. With respect to the intersection of RAD and Section 18, the revision 4 allows for joint processing of RAD and Section 18 disposition of the last 50 units, so we call the RAD Section 18 closeout blend. The PHA must be converting sufficient units under RAD that would result in the PHA having 50 or fewer units, and the units being converted through RAD must be in the same project as units being removed through Section 18. So as an example, a PHA with an 80-unit high-rise could convert 30 units through RAD and take the other 50 units through Section 18 and go through a single process. They'd be working through us, and we would be coordinating and sharing files with PIH's Special Application Center to make sure that both RAD and Section 18 requirements are satisfied. But PHAs would have a single point of contact for processing these transactions. Procedurally, this will mimic very much the existing process we have for RAD Section 18 blends, where submissions all occur via RAD and the RAD Resource Desk. Staying with RAD and Section 18, we know there are a lot of PHAs that are looking at both tools to reposition their public housing. When we've made sure we've got a relatively simple process for PHAs that wish to switch from RAD to a SAC application, and have tried to make the instructions for that very clear in the RAD notice and simplified. We also require that when RAD and Section 18 are mixed, that the RAD relocation requirements, including the right to return and Uniform Relocation Act requirements, would apply to the Section 18 units when those units are going to be replaced with project-based assistance. Otherwise, Section 18 has distinct relocation requirements, and to make sure that residents get a standard set of robust benefits, we've applied the RAD relocation rights for all residents. So the PHAs submitted their financing plan, and we've made a couple of changes within the financing plan and our underwriting criteria. First, we've extended the exemption from subsidy layering review if the PHA, we previously had an exemption for subsidy layering for a PHA's last property, but many PHAs are now thinking of Section 18 for their last property, given the justification for PHAs with 50 units or less, and therefore we've extended the exemption for subsidy layering review if the PHA will have 50 or fewer units after RAD conversion and has begun the Section 18 process. Second thing on this front is we've confirmed that RECAP will complete the subsidy layering review if there are non-RAD PBVs at the property. Every so often we receive a request for a subsidy layering review, and PIH's Financial Management Division has also received a request for approval for the same property, and that's just because there was RAD and non-RAD PBV. So here we clarify that our office can do the subsidy layering review for the entire property, and there's no need for a second review by PIH's office. Sticking with the financing plan, a couple of other changes. We require that any identity of interest be disclosed that are it's within the development team. So any if there is an identity of interest, it must be disclosed. And we prohibit the use of public housing funds as hard debt. So it's becoming more common than at the beginning of the program for RAD and non-RAD project-based vouchers to be mixed at a property. In order to facilitate the uniform treatment of residents at a converting property with non-RAD project-based vouchers, the Rev 4 extends all RAD resident rights to the non-RAD project-based voucher residents. So this includes the prohibition against rescreening, as we've talked about, the right of return and URA benefits, the resident rent phase-in, continued participation in ROS, FSS, Jobs Plus, or the Earned Income Disregard, resident participation rights and funding, termination notification and grievance procedures, as well as choice mobility. Though, of course, choice mobility is already standard in the PBV program. In addition, given the purposes of using project-based vouchers here to preserve publicly assisted properties, Revision 4 also extends the waiver of compliance with PBV poverty deconcentration goals for the non-RAD PBV units, since the end result will be preserving and retaining assistance in its current place. The Revision 4 enhances some of the detail that PHAs must make regarding the notification PHAs must make to residents before closing. So it enhances the detail that must be provided, including the anticipated timing of conversion, anticipated duration of rehab or construction, terms of lease and house rule, the anticipated relocation, and opportunities and procedures for exercising choice mobility. PHAs must also communicate its policy regarding phase-in of any tenant rent increases to affected residents. This is not stated as a required resident meeting, because a lot of this information will end up being individualized to specific households based on their situation. But PHAs have some discretion on how they wish to convey this information. We've made two changes impacting resident rights at conversion. So first of all, in the PBRA lease, in the house rules, required that there be a choice mobility provision built into the lease, which is already in the project-based voucher lease, but there was not one in the PBRA house rules. We've also required that the owner and the PHA maintain an agreement around choice mobility, around how residents avail themselves of the option, and any policies that the PHA or owner are putting in place around the choice mobility option. Revision 4 also clarifies with respect to the earned income verification that as a property converts and as PHAs submit EOPs or end of participations from the public housing program, that it does not trigger reporting of debts to the EIV system. In the world of preferences, it's always been the case that upon conversion, properties cannot be designated for a particular occupancy in the PBRA or PBV programs. Any preferences should be established prior to conversion. So for PBRA, owner-adopted preferences must be submitted to the multifamily field office prior to conversion. And for project-based vouchers, the PHA should be amending their Section 8 admin plan prior to conversion. The notice also encourages, with respect to preferences, that owners with site-based waiting lists, oftentimes public housing waiting lists, or maybe site-based or maybe community-wide, but VAWA transfers are easier to execute where the PHA is managing all the waiting lists. So Revision 4 encourages owners with site-based waiting lists to facilitate emergency transfers across properties through residency waiting list preferences. Revision 4 updates some of the language regarding the ownership and control of the properties to align with changes that were made in the 2018 Appropriations Act. The chart here shows some of the changes. So at conversion, it's always been the case, or at and during the term of the contract, we should say, that a public or nonprofit entity must always own or control the property. The FY18 Appropriations Act clarified that when tax credits are used, interest, and as well as following foreclosure, bankruptcy, or termination and transfer for material violation, that priority in ownership would not just be for a public body, but for a public or nonprofit body. So across these three areas, it puts public and nonprofit bodies on the same level. Back to the bullet on the top, it also fully aligns the standard set of ownership and control requirements, whether or not tax credits are involved. So statutorily, there are different words used. There's sufficient interest is used in the case of tax credits, but Revision 4 really aligns sufficient interest with control, makes those words synonymous, so that in the case below, a public or nonprofit would need to have a controlling interest in the property, not just which is no different than essentially the kind of interest, kind of control they would have over a property outside of the tax credit context. So PHAs have been able to rent bundle across RAD and non-RAD project-based vouchers to ship subsidy in a cost-neutral way. This is a change. Non-RAD PBV will first be placed under an AHAP. This was a hole in our process before. The RAD PBV HAP contract would include post-rehab rents in order to facilitate this process, and more details provided in the notice if this case were to come up. With respect to transfers of assistance, the notice requires that the PHAs describe the future use of the former public housing site within their financing plan, and that the PHA identify the treatment of the declaration of trust. And there's essentially three options that the PHA could choose. The first, and what we think would be most common, is that the PHA requests that the DOT be released and replaced with an alternative use agreement. This alternative use agreement would have a 20-year term and would require that either the property or any net income generated from the property be restricted to affordable housing purposes. The PHA must retain records of and annually report to its board on the use of the property or income, and the PHA may request, or the owner may request, future removal of the covenant if the property is sold and the proceeds are used for affordable housing purposes, or if another affordability covenant is placed on the property. That is, if 7 years into the term, the PHA stops using the property as low-income housing or housing for a low-income population and decides that it wants to sell, it would just come back in to HUD and explain how the proceeds would be used for affordable housing purposes. Or if in 7 years they decided to redevelop the property with tax credits and a new tax credit LURA was put at the property, we would be able to remove our covenant, knowing that the property would be used for affordable housing. Our office, the Office of RECAP, would manage any of these requests for release. That's option one. The second option a PHA has is to maintain the declaration of trust and separately pursue release under Section 18 or Part 200, or retention. The property would be, if the DOT is still on there, the property would be restricted to public housing uses. The benefit here would be that the PHA could use capital funds to support any demolition. But then the PIH Special Application Center would manage any requests, any subsequent requests to release that DOT through Section 18 or Part 200. And the last option, which we see once in a while, is for the at conversion for the DOT to be released because the property will be imminently sold at fair market value, in which case the proceeds would be used for affordable housing purposes. In most cases, though, we don't see PHAs are ready to sell the property right away, and so we think option one will end up being the more common path. Okay, still at closing, a few public housing considerations that once the property is closed. First is related to fair cloth. Prior versions of the RAD notice had reduced a PHA's fair cloth limit by the number of converted units, which would have excluded de minimis units from the fair cloth reduction. Revision 4 clarifies that it is actually reduced by the number of ACC units removed through RAD, which is actually already current practice. So in other words, if a 100-unit ACC property is removed from PIC and 98 units are placed under a HAP contract, the HUD has been reducing the PHA's fair cloth by the 100 units, which has been including the de minimis units. So revision 4 is more precise in the language in our practice, but to be fair, if there are any PHAs that wish to retain those de minimis units under its fair cloth that we had previously removed, so any conversions that have happened to date, the PHA must contact HUD within 90 days of publication of the RAD notice, so by November 4th, 2019, if it wishes to keep those units under its fair cloth cap. Second thing on this list, the revision 4 eliminated an ability for a PHA to establish a reserve at the converted property to fund housing authority closeout costs. So for PHAs that had converted its last units through RAD. So instead, PHAs should be either retaining public housing funds for this purpose or should be using unrestricted funds to fund closeout costs. With respect to Section 3, hiring and contracting requirements have always applied. We've always been applying those to RAD conversions. even though not necessarily required by statute. But there have been some ambiguity as to which set of Section 3 regulations apply. Revision 4 specifies that HUD is applying the regulatory requirements for housing and community development assistance for RAD conversions, except that, importantly, public housing and Section 8 residents would receive priority hiring preference in the process through our post-closing completion certification on the RAD resource desk and not through SPEARS. Speaking of the completion certification, prior versions of the RAD notice had required a completion cert for any work required in the RCC. Revision 4 expands the completion certification to include any conversions with no rehab. Of course, it turns into a much simpler completion certification, but there's still some important information that we need to collect. Guidance is already available on how to complete this certification on the RAD resource desk. Notice makes two relevant changes to PBV administration post-closing. So first, prior versions of the RAD notice had always required the PHA board to approve the operating budget, but had never described the standards by which the board should be approving that budget. Revision 4 requires that the board review the operating budget and confirm that the deposits at the capital replacement reserve account have been made and are being made. On OCAF adjustments for PHA-owned properties, see HOTMA guidance in PIH 2017-21 on what is PHA-owned. Revision 4 clarifies that the independent entity that the PHA must secure to perform rent reasonableness must also be determining the contract rent OCAF adjustment. And last in our presentation, for Zero HAP residents in project-based voucher properties, typically when total tenant payments or TTP exceeds the gross rent, a unit is not included or removed from a PBV contract. We had already required an exception for this rule for any current residents, so that their unit remains on the contract and they remain assisted or protected by HUD assistance regardless of income, even though no subsidy was being paid. Revision 4 allows PHAs to request a waiver to permit the future admission of Zero HAP residents for converted properties and lays out some of the criteria that HUD would consider in such a waiver. Okay, so that is all we have in our presentation. We will turn now to questions and see what we can respond to here. So first question, basically, will the slides be available? Yes, we will put them up on our website. They may actually already be on our website next to Revision 4, but if they're not, they'll be there very shortly. There's a question about portfolio awards. If you don't make progress on your portfolio award, what happens? So our requirement is that starting in the second year from the portfolio award, the PHA closes at least 2 projects or 25% of the properties each year. If a PHA is not making progress, HUD may revoke the portfolio award. The PHA may be able to come back in and request new authority under RAD, but we will revoke a portfolio award if the PHA is not making adequate progress. There's a question about if RAD is combined with Section 18, 50 and under, can this be done with 4% and 9% tax credits? Absolutely. We fully expect there are going to be housing authorities that combine RAD and Section 18 in order to RAD and non-RAD PBV and couple that with 4% and 9% financing. The question about the reserves and about the capital needs assessment exemption. So again, this is for properties that are either proposing to do new construction or using 9% tax credits, or that have recently been newly constructed or that have recently used 9% tax credits before coming into conversion. That the entire capital needs assessment, the transaction is exempt from submitting a capital needs assessment if the PHA commits to an annual deposit reserve level initially of $450 per unit per year. Clarification on the use of public housing funds for hard debt is requested. So previously the RAD notice did not comment on the use of public housing funds as hard or soft debt. In the vast majority of conversions where PHAs have put public housing funds in, it has been used as, it has been contributed as either grant or as soft debt. And then only occasionally have we come across cases where PHAs have proposed to use it as hard debt. So revision 4 has clarified that we would not be accepting the use of public housing funds as hard debt in the transaction. Clarification was requested on the significance of September 30th, 2024. So our statutory authority to implement RAD says that we can accept applications after September 30th, 2024. This date has been extended at least 2 times by Congress since the initiation of RAD, and so could very well be extended before we ever get to that date. But for now, we are under a time cap. There's a clarification requested on the Section 18 50 unit justification. So Section 18 allows a PHA with 50 or fewer units, PHA wide, to take the remaining those remaining 50 or fewer units through Section 18. Applies to the PHA's entire public housing portfolio, that the 50 number, not at the property level. So this training will be posted as well as the slides. It'll be available on the RAD resource desk. There are also some questions that are being submitted that are pretty transaction or PHA specific that we will follow up with you afterwards, just so as not to use everyone else's time. There's a question about portfolio awards. Would HUD consider extension requests where it takes more than a year to close a phase of the conversion? So just to clarify, each individual CHAP will be assessing two things. One is the progress made by an individual CHAP award, an individual transaction, with an initial financing plan due date of 9 months or 270 days. And we fully expect that there are going to be reasonable justifications to extend those beyond 9 months, waiting for tax credits or arranging other due diligence. We are also looking at a PHA's progress in converting properties under its overall portfolio award, and the expectation of at least 2 projects per year, or 25% of total portfolio units per year, starts in year 2. So essentially, a PHA gets on its overall portfolio structure gets an extra year of time to close phases and transactions. There was a clarification on Faircloth and the significance of the November 4th date. We've made a technical change on how Faircloth reductions are calculated as PHAs convert properties through RAD. The November 4th deadline gives PHAs a window during which they can request that any de minimis units any de minimis units be added back to their Faircloth authority if they had made conversions so far in the last 5 or 6 years where there were de minimis units included in the transaction. HUD had been reducing those from Faircloth, and we're willing to add those back into a PHA's Faircloth, but during a certain window. There's a question about, we've covered Zero HAP families in PBV conversions. We did not talk about Zero HAP families in PBRA conversions because it is already the case that the RAD notice allows both for current families or grandfathered families that if they're Zero HAP, they can be, they would remain under the contract, and it also applies to future admissions already in PBRA conversions. Oh, good question. Are you still required to submit for 9% tax credits in the immediate next round? And if tax credits are not awarded, can you keep the CHAP and retry the next round? So thank you, Hillary. We have eliminated the requirement that 9% tax credits, that PHA has to apply for 9% tax credits in the very next round, and can be more lenient on that front. Still, the CHAP, the PHA must be making progress in pursuit of the CHAP in the transaction, but it's no longer required that the PHA will lose its CHAP if it had not successfully applied for a 9% application in the next round. There's a request to repeat my response on Zero HAP families in PBRA conversions. So again, the context is RAD rents are often well below the market rents, and normally in Section 8, if a tenant who has no HAP subsidy due would not be admitted into the program. We have allowed any current families to be grandfathered in and still be admitted into Section 8 and still have a right to remain and have their lease renewed under Section 8. even if they are zero HAP families. And for PPRA conversions, the RAD notice is already has always extended that also to new admissions. So new admissions would still need to be income eligible for admission into the Section 8 program, but they do not necessarily have to have HAP subsidy due. There's a question about clarification about the tenant protections that have been extended to non-RAD PBV units, whether that includes the right sizing protections, and yes, it does. Similarly, can a resident be included in the HAP contract even if they're in the wrong size unit? Yes, if they're grandfathered residents, they may be overhoused temporarily right now. And the conversion occurs, they would have a right to remain, but they should be moved to an appropriately sized unit within the property as soon as is feasible. A PHA, of course, prior to conversion, PHAs should be following their ACOP, and that may involve right sizing the residents, right sizing the household to an appropriate unit before the conversion. There's a question about the subsidy land review exemption for PHAs that will have less than 50 units as a result of the RAD conversion. The question is whether or not the RAD and Section 18 need to be jointly processed in order for it to be eligible for this, or whether they can be distinct applications. And the answer is they can be distinct applications that are, in many cases, they will be distinct, and as long as the PHA will be under 50 units as a result of the RAD conversion and has initiated a Section 18 application, they would be exempt from the subsidy land review for RAD. One question on whether the blends between RAD and Section 18 are extended also to streamlined voluntary conversion. They're not, and the primary reason is that streamlined voluntary conversion primarily is a conversion to tenant-based vouchers. That there is not a as of right ability to use it as a preservation program, and so we're not encouraging combinations of RAD and voluntary conversion together. Another question on RAD and Section 18, whether the joint review would only apply to a PHA with remaining 50 units. No, if a PHA had, in our example, say an 80-unit high-rise, it could jointly use RAD and Section 18 by converting 30 units through RAD and 50 units through Section 18. So the PHA could have more than 50 units to initiate that process. Question about closeout costs and whether we can elaborate on that a little bit further. So any PHA that's completing the conversion of all of its public housing units, then subsequently, unless it's planning to produce more public housing units under its fair cost authority, would be expected to close out its public housing program, which includes certain audit costs and other legal costs that the PHA should make sure it's budgeting for. And so we're clarifying the RAD notice that those costs should be covered by either public housing funds that it's retained or by some unrestricted funds. Okay, with that, it is 3 o'clock Eastern time. We appreciate all those who have been able to join. Again, this will be recorded if you want to listen again or if you want to share with friends. We'll attempt to respond to some of the remaining questions that we were not able to get to separately. But please follow up if you do not hear from us. You know how to catch us at rad@hud.gov. But thank you again for joining, and we hope this helped to clarify some of the changes in the RAD notice.